In the last video, SRAS, LRAS, and Keynes, you learned how the neoclassical and classical economists explain self-correction, and also how and why John Maynard Keynes objected to that, because he saw that investment was volatile, that it wasn't necessarily true that money that was saved today would become investment money tomorrow. And he advocated for interventionist fiscal policy, which namely involved government spending and taxes. So in this lesson, which is going to be a little bit shorter, we're going to look at how fiscal policy interventions can stabilize the economy during either a period of inflation or a period of recession. We're only going to look at graphing the solutions. And then the next day, you'll look at using the multiplier again. So we'll have more sophisticated questions like if you should raise taxes, how much should you raise taxes? Or if you're going to cut government spending, by how much should you cut government spending? But for this lesson, we're just going to look at the graphs. So we've been looking at this graph, the SRAS and AD graph, and we've added in long-run aggregate supply. So fiscal policy is going to be used when we have one of our two major problems, either unemployment or inflation. So first we need to know what those problems look like. And actually I'm going to start by showing you what it looks like when we don't have either of those problems. So here's our nice little perfect world scenario where we have our current level of output, where SRAS and AD intersect, happens to be exactly at the long run. So we're working at capacity, we are at the natural rate of unemployment, there's no cyclical unemployment, everything is going great in our economy. But then something happens. So what are the potential things that could happen? Well, one thing is that we could enter a period of high unemployment. So what could happen potentially is, I'm going to draw this on here, we could end up in a situation where aggregate demand for some reason shifts to the left, maybe because of like the housing crisis in around 2008, right? And people's houses are losing value, people are losing their jobs, aggregate demand drops, consumer spending drops, and we're having this downward cycle in the economy. So what happens here? Well, over here we were at full employment output. And here, we're no longer there, right? Now, all of a sudden, we have some unemployment. We have some resources not being used. You could say we're inside the PPC, right? And our price level has also fallen. So we've fallen from our initial price level to this price level. And of course, the classical economists would say, well, it'll take care of itself, right? That workers will accept lower wages, SRAS will shift back to the right, we'll end up back at full employment just at a lower price level. But Keynes said, remember, that could take a really long time to happen, and we don't necessarily want people to starve and suffer in the meantime. So Keynes would actually advocate for using a fiscal policy intervention. One thing he would advocate for is increasing government spending. The other would be decreasing taxes. If you increase government spending, because government spending is a component of aggregate demand, remember aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X, right? Because government spending is one of those components, it will directly shift aggregate demand back to the right. And in an ideal world, right, you'd be able to time it so perfectly that you would get aggregate demand right back to where you wanted it to be. Problem solved. So it's a fairly simple graphing exercise. Aggregate demand has fallen to the left, and you use some government spending, maybe on firefighters or teachers or building new roads, bridges, and you just stimulate that aggregate demand right back to the right. The other possibility is to decrease taxes, and as we talked about before, that doesn't have a direct impact on aggregate demand, but when you decrease taxes, that increases people's disposable income, right? Their disposable income goes up, and because of that, their consumption goes up. And again, consumption is one of the components of aggregate demand, so the impact of the tax increase for our purposes here, it looks exactly the same. Now, you'll probably remember you would actually have to decrease taxes by more to have the same dollar impact on aggregate demand. But as far as graphing, you can just show it as a rightward shift in aggregate demand from the tax cut. Okay, I'm going to pause to erase, and then we'll look at this when the problem is inflation. Back to a clean graph again. So what could cause inflation? What could cause this problem of inflation? Well, one thing that can cause it, as we know, is excessive spending. right? So hyperinflation, inflationary expectations, but it doesn't even have to be that far. Just if people are feeling confident in the economy, they might be spending lots and lots of money and they are driving up output levels, right? We were at full employment, now we're a little bit beyond, and it will also drive up price levels. If you recall, what happens is the price level and the output go up, at least temporarily, right? Temporarily, we're operating beyond the PPC. We've drawn people into the workforce. We're getting people to work overtime, right? And prices are going up. And again, the classical economists would say, just wait. Wages are going to increase. We're going to end up back at full employment. But Keynes believed that the government could use its powers to deal with this problem as well. So I'm going to erase these, right? What is it that the government would do now? Well, if the government wants to decrease aggregate demand, remember, aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X. So one thing the government could do is just directly decrease its own spending. So if the government decreases its own spending, that's going to shift that aggregate demand curve back to the left. And again, done perfectly, right, we end up right back where we started, back at that lower price level and back at full employment output. What could we do with taxes? Well, if we're facing a problem of inflation, one way to curb inflation is actually to increase taxes. So we could increase taxes, and because increased taxes will decrease people's disposable income, that will decrease their consumption. And again, we have impacted one of the components of aggregate demand. So aggregate demand will shift back to the left and we'll end up right there. So to summarize, what are the strategies that we can use to deal with unemployment and inflation? Well, pretty straightforward, right? The strategies to deal with unemployment, one is increase government spending, and one is decrease taxes. And again, these are Keynesian fiscal policies. Dealing with inflation, decrease government spending, increase taxes. This part of it's not particularly complicated. This is another graphic just showing you, okay, we're in a recession, right? We are below full employment. We have what we call a recessionary gap here, another term for recession. That's the amount that we've fallen short of our potential GDP. So we use one of those policies, increase government spending, cut taxes, shift AD, okay, and we're back to the right amount. And as I said, we'll come back to this and we'll talk about how we can use the multiplier to determine how much we need to change spending or how much we need to change taxes. But we will save that for another day. Similarly, we can look at the next graph, which just shows from the textbook, a graph showing contractionary fiscal policy. So if aggregate demand has, for some reason, moved out here, right, excessive spending is causing inflation, and we're operating, at least in the short run, a little bit beyond our full employment, rather than waiting for things to adjust themselves and risking the possibility of hyperinflation. Instead, the government can either cut its own spending or increase taxes to shift aggregate demand back to the left and reduce what we call our inflationary gap. So again, we will come back and we will use the multiplier to figure out, well, how much do we need to cut government spending by? Or how much do we need to increase taxes by? But for today, you just need to know how to do the graphing. So if you're in a situation where aggregate demand has shifted to the right, you need a strategy that's going to get it to shift back to the left. What would that be? Cut government spending, increase taxes. If aggregate demand has shifted to the left, what can you do? Increase government spending or decrease taxes. One final thought, and that is if you are suffering from stagflation, so if your problem is not either excessive demand or too little demand, if instead your problem is this, SRAS has shifted to the left, this would be 1970s America, right? And we now have stagflation because we have higher prices and lower output. The answer is no Keynesian fiscal policy is going to solve this problem. Right? There is nothing that we can do to aggregate demand. If we try to solve this problem by increasing aggregate demand, we'll cause even more inflation. and if we try to solve this problem by decreasing aggregate demand, will cause even worse unemployment. So Keynesian fiscal policy is designed to deal with problems of either excess or too little demand. It does not work to deal with stagflation.